expecting a few more people here tonight. I'm not going to bother introducing myself because I'm seeing that I think I know everybody in the audience. But I'm here to welcome you. This is the third in a series of events that we've had here in the school from the organization Hallways. We are delighted that tonight we have two folks here that are going to talk to us, as you can see, about helping your teen navigate today's social media environment. Our first one was last spring, where Rachel Hennis, the director of Hallways, came and spoke to us about consent. And then in November, Rachel returned with Blessing, and they spoke about understanding anxiety and perfectionism in our children. So we have videos of all of them, so we're videoing tonight, and if you're interested in seeing any of the ones that you missed, they're in the virtual backpacks. We can send you links. So before I turn it over to Blessing and Rachel, they'll introduce themselves, they'll let you know a little bit about what you can expect tonight. I just want to say a little bit about how we got here and acknowledge the role that the Health and Wellness Committee of the Parents Association played in having Hallways come and be a resource for us. About 2 years, where did Christine go? Is it 2 years or 3 years now? 2 years ago, Christine came to me and just said, I want to talk to you. I have some thoughts. I've been talking to some parents, but I'm also watching my child, my children, and I'm wondering about the ways in which we're thinking about how we're preparing our kids for the world beyond Bank Street. So our conversation really had to do with upper school life and what we were doing in community conversations. What do we used to tell kids about consent, about drug use, about peer pressure, bullying, and what are we doing now? So we began a conversation, and some other parents joined us. So Nani Cole joined us, Mary Pat Drady joined us, Jody Gordon, Rose Klein-Young, who's not here anymore. I'm going to make sure I don't leave anybody out. Amy Tamadia joined us from the pediatrician's perspective this year. And then we were very fortunate that Joe Stein decided to join us as well. We invited one of the upper school teachers to join us because we felt in order for this to have more life in the daily curriculum, we needed to have teacher buy-in. So there's work that will be going on this summer in terms of curriculum grants and planning to better use our community time in the upper school to address some of these issues. But in the meantime, curriculum change takes a long time, as you know. In the meantime, we're just very delighted that we've got the resources of Hallways, and that tonight we've got Rachel and Blessing, who will meet with us. Please help.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Thank you. So as you can see, our title is Helping Your Teen Navigate Today's Social Media Environment. Just a couple words about us. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer of Freedom Institute, which is actually the parent organization of Hallways. I've been there about 11 years. So I've actually gotten to watch Hallways from its inception grow into the program it is today, which is really exciting. And Blessing is one of our program managers, so she manages relationships with schools, does a lot of parent talks, develops curriculum, supervises some of the workshop facilitators who go out into classrooms around the city. And you're welcome. We'll have time for questions at the end, so we're happy to answer other things. So here's our agenda for the evening. I'm going to just give you a very brief overview of Hallways, just so you have an understanding of what our programming is and where we're coming from and sort of the foundation of our knowledge. We'll talk a little bit about effective risk prevention. We'll talk about today's social media landscape, and then we'll spend a good chunk of time on strategies for parents, and we'll make sure that we leave time for a Q&A at the end. If you've got a burning question that comes up as we're going, though, feel free to raise your hand. It's a fairly small group, so I think we can manage that. So Hallways is the school-based prevention program at Freedom Institute. Freedom Institute is an outpatient treatment center for people with alcohol and drug issues. We do work with individuals and families, ranging from individual and family therapy to an intensive outpatient program to ongoing advanced recovery groups for people who have been sober for years. So we've got kind of the whole spectrum from a treatment standpoint. And we started doing school programming about 30 years ago because we saw, initially it came out of, well, I wasn't around then, so I can't say we, but initially it came out of understanding, can everybody hear me? Yeah. The mic? Okay, good. Understanding the impact that parental substance problems had on kids in schools and wanting to start providing resources for those kids in the schools and sort of stop the cycle of addiction before it passed on to the next generation, with the idea that if you could prevent or delay kids from using, their chances of addiction are significantly lower. And for kids who are genetically at risk because their parents have issues, that's even more important. So we've been doing work in the schools for about 30 years. In any given year, we're working with anywhere from like 38 to 50 schools, all throughout the city, and a few in sort of the inner ring suburbs in Connecticut every once in a while, and some of the boarding schools occasionally. We take a community-wide approach to prevention and social emotional wellness. What we did when we built hallways a few years ago, we revamped the entire program based on the latest research about what helps kids avoid high-risk behaviors, whether it's drugs and alcohol, risky sexual activity, impulsive acting out, and really all the research shows that the best prevention is actually centered around social emotional wellness. So our model, just quickly, and different schools do different components of this model. We do a comprehensive strategic prevention assessment, which again is evidence-based, comes out of research done by a number of people and validated through the Society for Prevention Research. We go into a school and we look at each grade level separately and look at key risk and protective factors for that group of kids. And then we tailor our curriculum and our recommendations based on those factors. We use evidence-based strategies. We have skills-based lessons from various curricula that have been tested and written about and published about and demonstrated. And then we use those and choose and tailor them to match what the needs of a particular grade within a school are. So we do classroom workshops, we do faculty and advisor training, we do help with sort of health and wellness curriculum development, and then we also do parent and faculty work. So we do parent talks like this, and we do a fair amount of faculty training around sort of the most pressing issues. This year, the two biggest things we're seeing are consent, issues around consent, and vaping, which is exploding.
What was the last one?
Vaping, like the e-cigs, Juuls. Yeah, so your kids are a little younger, they're probably not quite there yet, but the e-cigarettes are taking off like wildfire amongst the middle and upper school kids in the city. Kids are like using in class, there's so much use going on. And then we always do evaluation at the end of the year after we've done programming in a school to look at what worked, what didn't, how effective was it. So our work is data-driven, community-based, ongoing and strategic, and person-centered. And the reason we highlight this on a slide is because there's a tendency as humans to kind of respond when a crisis comes up and want to come in and take quick action to fix something. But actually all the research and all the science shows that the best prevention is long-term and happens over a chunk of time based on data, involves the whole community, so it's not just a classroom, it's not just a nuclear family, it's the school, the parents, the kids, the peer group, the advisory council, the peer leaders, the sports teams, whoever else you've got in the kids' lives. And person-centered, again, looking at individual kids and then individual grade strengths and weaknesses. So let's talk a little bit about today's social media landscape. I'm just curious sort of what the age span of people's kids are. So how many people have teenagers, high school students? Okay. How many have like 10 to 12 tweens? Okay, so just about everyone. And how many have like 5 to 8, 5 to 9? Okay, and then anyone with little ones at home, like below 4? Okay. Anybody have any pressing sort of examples, questions, concerns that have come up around social media use that led to you being here tonight that we could sort of put out on the table to make sure we get to? All right, so just a snapshot of the data. Common Sense Media, who we'll talk about a couple of times tonight, did a census of media use by tweens and teens. And the data they found, and this was a national survey, and I actually think it probably, in my opinion, underreports for urban kids, but tweens in the 8 to 12-year-old range are spending an average of 4.5 hours a day on screens, and that includes all screens, so that includes television, their phones, tablets, computers. And 15% of them are using social media, and with tweens we see a big gender gap there. 9% of the boys are reporting that they use social media, and 22%, which is almost a quarter, obviously, of the girls. So there's a big difference there, which I'm sure you could all hypothesize about. And we'll send this, the PowerPoint of this presentation to Christine in the school so that you can get a copy, so you don't have to worry about taking notes or taking pictures. You're welcome to if you want. But. And then teenagers, so 13 to 18-year-olds, are spending over 6 hours a day on screens. 58% of them are using social media, and again, I think that underreports for the population we work with. And a third of their screen time is on social media. So if you add up all their TV watching, all their computer time, all their tablet time, all their phone time, social media is a third of that. So that's 2 hours a day. And when you ask kids, only 44% of girls and 29% of the boys say that they enjoy social media a lot, which is really fascinating to stop and think about how much time they're spending doing it for how few of them say that they really enjoy it. And we're going to come back to that later. Sure.
The 6 hours per day,
Uh-huh.
does that include time in class and homework?
That includes homework. It doesn't include time in class. So if you have tech time in class, then you would add to that.
When is it from?
Oh, sorry.
Sorry,
Yeah, go
which
ahead.
year is the research from, the study?
The latest they did was 2015. So
How many years ago?
it's been growing. I mean, if you even look at the data comparing like 2006 to 2011 to 2015, it's straight parallel.
And I'm sorry, these are self-reported by the children, not by their
It's-
parents?
They do a big national survey, mostly self-report from children, but they're also collecting data from parents and teachers. So I don't know how they aggregate it.
Okay, it's just-
You can go to their website. They've got a whole section on research. So we want to talk a little bit about the changing landscape that social media is, and I want you to think a little bit about how social media has changed the way that we engage with each other and the way that we engage with the world. Social media is constantly changing, and if there's one message we have for you tonight, it's that you cannot possibly stay ahead of your kids on this curve. You can't. It's constantly changing, and just when you figure something out, they're already 3 steps ahead onto the next thing. So the answer to sort of guiding and helping your kids through this stuff is not going to be the expert on all apps and all things social media. That's not the way to go. So back when we were kids, we were passing notes in class, right? Taking the phone and stretching the cord as far as you could to go into the other room so that your parents couldn't hear you talking. Writing notes and like passing them to each other in the hallway. Now there's texting, there's group chats, there's instant messaging, there's FaceTime, there's Whisper and Snapchat and all these other things that happens in usually a mobile phone, sometimes on a pad or a computer, but basically in sort of a privacy bubble shielded from parents. It was much easier for teachers and parents to see what was happening with kids when we were kids than it is for us to see what's happening with the kids that are around today. It's so easy for them to be doing things that just completely go under the radar. Again, we're not going to be able to help them by thinking that we can catch all this and police all this. We have to use a different strategy. If you think about, go back 15 years and imagine yourself with one of those like little Nikon Instapics or Polaroid camera, taking a picture of yourself and then running around and showing it to all your friends to see how many of them like it. And then doing the same thing again 20 minutes later. And then taking a picture of your meal and showing it to all your friends to see who likes it and who doesn't. And then a picture of the sweater you're wearing and a funny face that you could make. Like, people would have thought you were insane, right? That's crazy. But it's not crazy anymore. That's the norm in the social media environment that we're in. And that's not changing. So we have to kind of recognize that and figure out how to work with it or around it or set limits on it.
Just in terms of defining your terms, does social media, can you define where social media and technology, like, is texting social media or is emails?
Right, no, that's a
where are
good
the
question,
boundaries?
and the lines get fuzzy. I mean, typically when we talk about social media, we're talking about ways that kids or people, adults too do it, are using technology to interact with each other. So texting is like a really primitive form of social media. Facebook is a more sort of advanced, broader reach one. So we're including all of that. I think the risk levels are different based on how big the audience is and how advanced the technology is. But even within the things that seem more benign and simple, there are layers of it that sometimes we're not aware of as adults or that kids aren't aware of and they're sort of stumbling into blindly. So I'm using the term very loosely. I think the bigger challenges are with things like Facebook, Instagram, Snapchat, the gossipy apps. But even group chats on text can be an issue. How many times, I mean, I'm sure you see this all the time in the school. We hear so many stories about, you know, things that get said in group chats, and this person got left out, and this person didn't, and then this got forwarded to somebody else. And so even in the simpler technologies, it can get complicated really quickly. So before we completely pathologize social media, which is easy to want to do, right? Let's talk a little bit about the benefits of it. It gives, and again, I'm using social media broadly, but it has these benefits. It gives kids access to resources and information. There's more ways than just Google to find things out. Kids also learn things, like I personally see a lot of news headlines and things that I'm interested in on my Twitter feed, right? And kids have some of that same experience. Kids learn things from each other. They're able to access resources and information through, for instance, a Facebook group for kids who are into theater, or a Twitter feed for kids who are into, what's that little character? I can't even think of his name, but whatever, the latest little things. Creativity and self-expression. At an age, tweens and teens are really developing identity. And so having a chance to sort of portray an identity, or test out an identity, or test out or discover an aspect of themselves that maybe they don't show in their everyday life, can be beneficial for them. It can help them develop confidence. It can help them sort of feel empowered to become a broader person. It can give them a way to do things kind of safely, especially shyer kids or kids who are more introverted. Sometimes it's easier for them to take those risks in a technology setting than it is in a face-to-face setting, which obviously has its drawbacks too. Ability to connect with diverse groups of people. Social media, kids are connected to each other, and then they're connected to other kids. Kids are connected across schools all across the city. They end up sometimes connected to kids from other states, or like kids make friends on social media with their camp friends, and then their camp friends become friends with their friends' camp friends. And I'm sure if you looked at your kids' social media stuff, well, your kids are still kind of young, but they've got hundreds more friends and followers than any of their parents do, typically, because their networks connect like that. And it exposes them, they get to meet a broader group of people than who they might meet in their day-to-day life. It's a more diverse group than just their classmates or their soccer teammates. Reduced isolation is a benefit of social media. It can also be, social media can be isolating, so that's a two-sided coin. But particularly for kids who feel marginalized, or kids who have identities or different ability level, different learning styles, or are differently abled, there's a solidarity and a support they can find by being involved in online communities with people that have similar experiences to them. That can be tremendously positive for them. There's a whole thing in Andrew Solomon's book, Far From the Tree, I don't know if any of you have read it, but about how people with dwarfism connect through social media, and it now has turned into this big thing where they have this big convention every year, and it's the only time they all get to be together and feel normal, and everything is adjusted for their size, not typical size, and what a powerful experience that is for them. So that's just one example of that. And then opportunities to access resources confidentially, which is always a little bit risky to say to a group of parents, but a kid who's got questions that they're not comfortable asking about, how do I know if I'm gay, or how do people get pregnant, or lots of different things to do with LGBTQ identity, sexuality. Sometimes kids have concerns about their friends, like my friend is doing this, is it dangerous? There's lots of ways that kids are able to access information, not always reliably, but sometimes in good ways too. Okay, so risks. The first thing that people tend to think of when we talk about risks of social media are like the stranger danger, online predator stuff that you sometimes see sensationalized on the NewsHour programs, and cyberbullying, right? And we've all seen the stories on the news. There was that girl a couple years ago, what was her name? Oh my gosh, she just blanked on it. I didn't write it down. Nope, it was a girl who got, Amanda Todd, that was her name. Did anyone hear that? It was this horrendous story about this girl that got sort of pressured into taking a picture with her shirt lifted up, and then it got shared and went viral, and then she started getting bullied at school, so she switched schools, but the kid who had initially sort of started this whole thing found her friends at her new school through social media and started it all there, and it became this whole big long thing. And clearly this was a kid, she had some other vulnerabilities as well, but she ended up killing herself. And it was all over the news. This was going back about 3 years now. And I remember there was a big uproar because parents were just in a panic, understandably, like, how do I keep my kid safe? This kid's mom didn't even know this was happening. So it's frightening. Online predators are actually a much smaller risk and easier to sort of teach your kids the basics about who they talk to, who they make friends with, don't meet a stranger, don't share personal information, sort of all that basic safety stuff. The one caveat I would give to that, though, is kids' definition of who they know has been really profoundly impacted by social media. So if I'm a 16-year-old and I've connected on social media with a friend of a friend, and we've chatted or commented on each other's stuff or liked each other's stuff, or we found out we both loved some movie or we wear the same, whatever, color clothes, I think I know her now. And you'll hear kids say this. She's not a stranger. I've been talking with her for months. But they've never, ever, ever met face to face. And people have romantic relationships based on the same thing. We're like, well, we've been girlfriend, boyfriend for 6 months. Really? How often do you hang out? Well, actually, I've never met him. But in their minds, in their world, this is the world they're operating in. So it's just important to be aware of that difference because it translates differently when you say, well, don't share this with people you don't know. Because to you, that means something much more, contained. Pervasiveness, and one more thing about emotional safety. Kids on the internet, and the tween age is where kids are really vulnerable to this, end up getting exposed to things that they're not mature enough to handle. And it can happen by accident. They're innocently doing a search for something for a paper and they misspell a word or they type something in that has a double entendre that they don't know about. And suddenly the whole screen is flooded with ads for porn sites that are flashing triple X's at them. Or there's stuff that YouTube is particularly bad for this. There's videos on YouTube about everything. And kids go innocently looking for something that their friend told them they should watch because it's funny, and they end up seeing 100 Faces of Death, which literally is videotape of people dying. And like young kids are not equipped for that. So these are things to be aware of and to have conversations with your kids about. Like, look for this stuff, and if you see it, come tell me right away. Not look for it, but I mean, if you see it, pay attention.
So, question about pervasiveness.
Yes.
So here at Bank Street, at least in the upper school, a lot of the homework is done online.
Right.
Which means that constant distractions
Yep.
are coming across their screen
Yep.
as they're going out to get good information and
Yep.
research. There are 100 obstacles to getting back to work
Yep.
because they're now out there.
Yep.
And also, they're kids. Just like adults, their minds wander while they're working, and why don't I go check this out? There was a scene in the movie Screenagers where the kid talks freely about, well, of course I go off and go look at other things, and then I know how to really quickly get back to it when my parents walk in.
Mm-hmm.
What do we do about that?
Mm-hmm.
How do we keep them
Yeah.
focused and on track?
Yeah, we're going to come back to more specific strategies for that when we get to part 4 in the agenda, but that is a big issue. And even if their computer isn't doing that, they've got their phones next to them a lot of the time, right? So it's the same thing. The other thing with pervasiveness is not just how readily available it is while they're sitting at a device, it's the pervasiveness of the social interaction as well. So when we were kids, if you had an argument with somebody at school, you went home, maybe you had a phone conversation with somebody about it later, it kind of blew over, and usually by the next day, it was sort of over, or maybe it wasn't, but it wasn't such a big deal. Now, if you have an argument with somebody at school, you're on social media with all your friends, and they're on social media with all their friends, and everybody else is weighing in, and it spreads like wildfire, and it keeps going all night long. So what used to be a 3 o'clock argument before everybody got on the bus has now turned into a 3 o'clock till bedtime drama that then carries into the next day. And teachers we work with will tell us a lot that kids come into school upset about something that happened online last night. Somebody made a comment about this, or somebody flirted with my boyfriend, or somebody didn't like my artwork that I posted, whatever it is, and they're starting the day with something that didn't even happen at school. So it's like this 24-hour continuation of things that we used to be able to contain in better time pockets. And then in the case of cyberbullying, again, if you had a bully at school back in the old days, at least when you went home, you had a little bit of relief. If you're being cyberbullied, anytime you're near your device or your computer, it's happening. There's no relief. It's so persistent and so pervasive. Privacy and security concerns. Kids have a hard time understanding that what goes online stays online forever and ever. Kids tend to think of their phones as sort of their private property, their lockbox, their diary, this is where all my stuff is. And they don't realize that really it's such a portal into this wide open world that's not regulated and has very few boundaries, and where people with any kind of sophistication and computer skills can find stuff and dig out information about you. We hear a lot of stories about kids, even with Snapchat, where you take a photo and you send it to someone and then it disappears after X number of seconds. But the kid who receives it can screenshot that, and then they've got it forever. And we often hear stories of kids who have Snapchatted somebody, and then somebody takes a screenshot and they pass it on to somebody else, and pretty soon it's gone viral, when really this was meant to be a personal conversation or communication between one person and another. Digital footprints follow kids. It is not uncommon for colleges to search kids' social media records and look at sort of their digital footprint. There was an example, not last summer, but the summer before, of 10 kids who were involved in some really negative stuff on social media, and they got de-admitted from Harvard in the summer when it was too late to apply anywhere else. So colleges are paying attention, and employers. I mean, obviously your kids are young, you're not thinking about their jobs yet, but it's pretty common for employers to do a digital background check on people. And if you've got some dumb photo from when you were in high school and you did some stupid thing with a costume or a beer or whatever it is, or a joint, that stays. That somebody can find that somewhere. 92%, and digital footprint isn't just what kids create for themselves, it's also what we create. 92% of US kids under the age of 2 already have a digital presence. And with the facial recognition technology that's there now and the advances in machine learning, computers can recognize kids' faces even as the kids age. And you can take an image of somebody, and if you've got some decent sleuthing skills, which not everybody does, but you can take an image of somebody and just their photo, that's all you've got, plug it into the right search engines and find out all their personal info. So it's important to be aware of this stuff, and even for ourselves, what we're posting about kids, identifying information, photos with street signs in, geotags with at Bank Street School or at this movie theater or whatever it is, that stuff's trackable.
I have a question about that.
Sure.
Do privacy settings matter at all with those things?
Yes, they do, and they can be gotten around. So I think, and again, Blessing will get more to this later, I think having privacy settings set as sort of tightly as you can is really important, and having all the controls in place to sort of block porn sites from popping up on your computer and keep your Wi-Fi secure and all of that. It's important to do that. So it's not meaningless, but there are ways that people have found to get around it, including the kids themselves. So even, well, we'll talk more about this in a minute, but even the parental monitoring apps, kids know how to get around them. So yes, it's important, and if that's the main thing or the only thing that you're relying on, that's probably not enough. Okay, so more risks of social media, page 2. A big one, I think, especially for kids in this tween age group, is the idea of sort of the curated self. Nobody's posting all the time their genuine, real self on social media. It's always curated and cultivated. And what we see on social media is also what we're evaluating ourselves by. We do this even as adults, right? Like I have a friend, an old friend, but we're also social media, Facebook friends. And if you just looked at her Facebook feeds, she is perfect. She exercises 800 times a week. She eats completely healthy. Her child is perfect. Her job is perfect. Her house is immaculate. She's never lost her temper. Like, how does she possibly function, A, getting all this stuff done, and she never has a sad moment, right? Because that's how it looks. But I know her in real life, and I know like sometimes her kid drives her crazy, or she has an argument with her husband, or the other room in her house is a wreck, or what have you. But we compare our inside selves to the outside selves that other people are presenting. And as adults, we have the abstract thinking to take a step back and recognize that that's what we're doing. Tweens do not have that yet. They don't have the brain development for that yet. So if a tween looks and everybody else on their social media feed got a new PlayStation for Christmas, they're the only one who didn't. They're not seeing all the people who didn't post stuff or seeing all the people who didn't get to go on a fancy vacation. They're only seeing the ones who did, or the people who won a prize or won a trophy. They're not seeing all the times that person lost a game, but they can't abstract that. So they're really at risk in terms of their self-esteem and their identity by comparing themselves, and also by developing a sense of worth and being liked for this curated self rather than the real self. And sort of the reality checking around that, I heard a really scary story a couple of weeks ago on NPR about a household where they had just gotten Alexa, and about 3 weeks after getting Alexa, the mother had to have a conversation with the 3-year-old because she thought Alexa was a new person living in their house, based on the parents talking to her and her answering and doing all these magical things like turning on the lights and playing a certain song and what have you. And that's a little kid, and obviously she got better information than that, but it really brings up the question of how kids are internalizing this technology in this sort of virtual world that we've created. Unchecked promotion of unhealthy behaviors and standards. Kids on social media are exposed to so much, and media in general, just to use it more broadly, so much risky, negative, dangerous stuff. Substance abuse is normalized. There's a lot of sexuality and sexualized imaging, even of young people. There's really sort of a lot of the stereotypical ideals about how you're supposed to look and how you're supposed to behave. Whiteness is really valued. Being thin and blonde is really valued. There are entire communities online and websites that are called thinspo sites, where people with anorexia go to encourage each other in their eating disorder and try to get thinner. So there's a lot out there that we don't necessarily know about. 20% of middle school students, so an average age of 12.3, have received a sexually explicit message or photo, either inadvertently or on purpose. And I can't find the other percentage, but a really high number of them see images of other kids drinking, smoking, vaping, using drugs online, and it's all glorified and glamorized. And also they're getting bombarded by ads. Okay, and then the disinhibition effect, that is basically the buffer that social media creates, preventing kids from understanding that their actions have real consequences. And so you see kids who, and you see this with adults too, like how many comment sections have you read after a news article and you just can't believe the level of vitriol? Or you see these stories about trolls who go around like looking for people to post nasty things about. They wouldn't have the courage to walk up to that person and say that to their face. But this buffer of social media allows that kind of behavior, and the same thing happens with kids. And the anonymity of it encourages people to be less responsible, less thoughtful, less kind, and people engage in cruelty and all kinds of behavior that actually goes against their values or their family's values, because somehow it doesn't seem real to them, or doesn't seem like it has a real impact. And then the rapid spread of misinformation. This happens in two ways. One is kids tend to believe what they read, right? So some of the schools, I don't know if you guys do this here, but some schools have instituted sort of a whole media literacy curriculum around the internet, and like how do you tell if the research you're doing on the internet is good or not? So that's a thing for sort of older kids. But even with younger kids, there are rumors that get started that take off like wildfire. And recently I've seen more of this happening around the school shooting issues. So after the most recent massacre that happened in Florida, about 3 days after that, somebody saw an old news story from a school shooting that happened in, I think it was Detroit or something, but they didn't realize that was an old story, and so they were spreading it as if it was a news story and another one, and that took off like wildfire, and all the kids were believing it, and once again, being sort of re-traumatized and reactivated, even though this wasn't a new event. And it's happened, we've seen it happen with rumors about kids dying, or rumors about people's parents getting divorced, all kinds of stuff, from like big global news stories to daily social gossip. And it spreads quickly with these kids because they've got tons of friends and their friends have tons of friends, and it just one click and it's forwarded on to the next group of people. Also with this, there are some companies, and actually this is one thing where vaping, we really see a lot of this, who pay for research to support their sales, basically. So if you try to have a conversation with a high school kid about vaping, they'll say, well, I went online and I researched it and it said it's harmless. But if you have them dig into who did that research, who paid for it, where is it coming from, surprise, surprise, it's the company that's trying to sell these vaping products to teenagers. So there are lots of examples around that. We see the same thing around marijuana. So even when kids are earnestly trying to do the right thing, they can't always tell what's accurate information and what's not. And one last thing I want to add to this, and then we'll do the health effects, but there's a journal called Computers and Human Behavior, and they did a study with tweens and teens about their ability to accurately recognize emotions on other people's faces. Kids who spend more time on social media, that ability decreases. So the more time kids spend on social media, the less able they are to look at me or you and tell if you're angry, sad, disappointed, impatient, bored, happy to see them, excited, whatever it is. The interesting thing, though, is that can be actually mitigated in really short periods of time. So they took the same kids and they divided them in half, and they sent 5 of them off to camp with no media, no technology, no nothing, and kept the other half here. And when they brought them back, the kids who had just been away for 5 days, who had scored the same as the control group before camp, came back from camp and were back to normal levels of facial emotional recognition again. So that's just to reinforce the point that having limits and boundaries around this stuff actually does make a difference. And if you can contain and control how much time your kids spend doing this stuff, you actually can have a positive impact on their functioning. This you'll get, obviously, when you get the slides, but it's just a quick overview of some of the research results around, then this is screen time altogether, so this isn't just social media, but kids playing video games, kids doing social media, kids on TV, kids watching YouTube, kids watching endless episodes of some series that they're binge watching on Netflix. So all that screen time added together, these are the impacts that it has on kids. You've heard of all the, the obesity and heart disease ones. There's been a lot of talk in the media about kids and obesity. There's also a lot of research supporting the idea that kids who spend a lot of time on screens, and especially on social media, have higher levels of depression and anxiety. And and then sleep problems. So kids, not only are kids staying up too late on screens, but the blue light that lights screens interrupts the circadian rhythms in your brain. So kids who spend a lot of time on media, particularly in the evenings, tend to have more disrupted sleep and to sleep less. So then you're seeing the fatigue, the irritability, the trouble paying attention, all of that. So what are we really dealing with here? Social media in particular, so Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, Snapchat, all those sort of social apps are literally programmed to be hyperstimulating and addictive. So if you think back to that stat about how much kids continue to use this stuff even when they're not really sure they're enjoying it when they reflect on it, I think that's part of the reason why. And what they found is that the actions involved in social media, whether it's posting a picture of yourself, getting a like from a friend, liking somebody else's thing, passing on a message, cause dopamine release in the brain. So essentially, every like or every tweet has the same dopamine effect as, excuse me, as a kid getting a hug. So it's incredibly reinforcing. The Silicon Valley wizards all know this. And I don't know if you've seen, but in the press in the last month or so, there have been several articles about high-profile Facebook executives who are sort of doing this mea culpa now and saying, wow, we didn't realize, we knew what we were doing, but we didn't realize it was going to be this bad. And really, they've actually formed a coalition with some of the other social media tech bigwigs to try and sort of start counteracting this and start a movement to get kids to decrease their social media activity and decrease their screen time, because they're seeing the impact that it has. And many of them share stories about how they purposely send their kids to schools that don't use a lot of technology and don't allow their kids to be on any of these apps at home. And this includes like the big executives at Facebook. Their kids aren't allowed to be on Facebook because they know how damaging it is. In face-to-face communication, the average person will express themselves or say something about their personal experiences 30 to 40% of the time. On social media, it's 80%. So what that means is it's way more reinforcing to be tweeting or Snapchatting pictures of something you just ate and something you just did, and here's where I am with my friends and we're doing this. That's a lot more reinforcing in the brain circuits than having a personal conversation. And it's a lot less effort. So it really is impacting the wiring in your brain and the dopamine circuits. And marketing firms have recognized this. So does anyone here work in marketing? So there are some things, I'd be curious to hear your comments on this. There are some articles I've seen in marketing, like trade industry journals, where they are talking about the dopamine links with social media and how their digital marketing strategies need to try and capitalize on this more. So things about trying to get kids to interact with things, trying to have images that are more appealing to kids, trying to get things where kids feel like they're getting attention or they're getting liked, because it causes that dopamine release and it helps them make a customer out of the kid. So bottom line is the kids need us to set limits. Because it's so reinforcing, because it's set up to be addictive, even for adults it is, right? And because they're not very developed, they don't have the skills to stop themselves. We have to set limits and boundaries for them and help them navigate this world, which Blessing is going to talk more about in a minute. It's easy to kind of want to either throw up your hands in despair or over-police every single thing, but I don't think either of those things are necessary. I think you have the tools that you need. It's really about relationships, communication, boundaries, and structure. And if you think about, I'm sure most of you don't let your kids just eat unlimited sugar and junk food whenever they want, right? There's some structure around it, there's some rules around it. If you give a kid the opportunity, especially a young kid, excuse me, I can't lose my voice here. If you give a kid the chance, they'll happily eat cookies all day and skip dinner. We don't expect them to regulate themselves in that way. So we can't be expecting them to regulate themselves when it comes to social media and technology. We have to provide the boundaries for them. I'm going to turn it over to Blessing, and she's going to talk about some ways to do that. That was perfect. It was right out right at the end.
Thanks, Rachel. So, navigating social media with your tween. Rachel just covered some really sobering aspects of social media. I know it sounds extremely scary, and I'm here to say the good news is you are the main influence in your child's life, right? So it sounds like we have a range of, or that you all are parenting a range of ages up till high school in this room, and I think for those who have the older teenagers, you may know that there may be some resistance sometimes to sort of taking in that parent influence, but you still are the main influence, whether it's obvious or not. And really want to highlight that and focus in on that, because I think more than any sort of protections out there, privacy settings, it's really about you being the ultimate most important person in your child's life that really sort of brings home these points around their safety online. Home. Like Rachel mentioned, there is no magic app. I mean, I think that there are things, and I think Common Sense Media does an excellent job of sort of curating their site and providing that information if you do want to look into settings or apps that might help in terms of monitoring, etc. But at the end of the day, if there's a will, there's a way. There's always a way around these things, and why we say we're really much more focused on the relational aspects that sort of undergird these conversations rather than external sources like apps, right? The tricky thing is you have to be able to model the behaviors and attitudes that you want to see in your child, right? Technology is amazing. I love my iPhone as much as the next person, but I think also the amazing thing about young people is that they're quick to point out the discrepancy between what you have them do or what you tell them to do and what you're actually doing. So I think that piece of also sort of kind of having some self-awareness and reflection about what are some of the practices around social media or technology use in your home that you're sort of showing and putting out there and kind of unintentionally maybe communicating to your children. Then also the piece around parents, caregivers, whatever the situation is in terms of your child, wanting to be on the same page. This is one of those things where, kind of like Rachel mentioned, left to their own devices, young people's brains are still developing. They're going to do what's fun for them and what's immediate for them. And so this could be an opportunity for a divide and conquer situation. So I think it's really important to kind of be on the same team and be really clear as a parental unit what the expectations and boundaries are, and being united and sort of enforcing that in all levels with your child. Then there's the piece around tolerating the discomfort. Because I think for any of you who've been parenting for a while, you probably know all too well that the sort of consistency around boundary setting, around repeating yourself over and over and actually enforcing that can be exhausting. Sometimes it might just be easier to say, here's the phone, like get out my face, just let me have a moment. And this is the piece where we really want to encourage around the sort of, that piece where it's going to be a fight, it's going to be a battle, because anytime you're setting boundaries, likely there will be some sort of rule or boundary that your child is not a fan of. And I think being able to sort of keep the long game in mind and know that in the moment it's really going to take a lot of that energy from you to sort of, be able to set that and establish those norms in the household. And then lastly, really it's about talking and listening and setting those boundaries. Okay? So, communication, the theme for us for this evening. You just want to be proactive about talking early and regularly with your child about expectations around social media. I think especially the younger, I think at all ages you can have these conversations, but I think especially as your child, for the younger kids, I think this is a great time to really start early with laying that foundation before they get too solidified in in their teen years, where they tend to be much more focused on what their peers think of them versus what their parents think of them. So I think the younger you can kind of capitalize on the fact that they still think mom, dad, whoever is like the best and biggest person, the most perfect person in the world, this is the time to really start those conversations. I think also just being able to empathize, that piece around social media and the curated life, right? And putting things out there. I think this is a great opportunity to kind of share like examples like Rachel mentioned in terms of having friends, do it at whatever age you feel is appropriate, but sharing that you yourself may struggle with the perfect image that people put out there, knowing that sometimes you may be running late to work and struggling to get breakfast and get kids off to school and feeling frazzled, and knowing that, seeing other people yourself having these curated lives can be tricky. I think starting from when your children are young and sharing some of those things that you also struggle with can be a way to kind of connect with them around the pressures that they may be feeling to fit in and post certain things online. I think also just continuing to kind of use the teachable moments, even if their body language sometimes can appear shut down or closed, particularly for some of the older teens. I think that's a great opportunity to still kind of continue to have as many conversations as possible, knowing that it's not a one and done sort of situation. See your hand raised?
Yeah, I'm just I'm a little confused into what we're talking about with them.
Okay.
Because at this stage, this being proactive, talking early and regularly,
Mm-hmm.
they don't actually know about social media. So am I talking to them about social media,
Mhm.
or and the trappings and pitfalls, but they don't know about it yet. They're curious, but they're not actually asking just yet, and certainly not in an informed way. So am I introducing something that I'm scared about, because I am, and that's why I'm here. But they don't know me yet I'm not sure if I'm making that much sense.
No, I
but I'm
think
trying to understand what I'm actually talking about with them. I get these ideas, but
Are you parenting younger? What
a
age?
9-year-old.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I think, I mean,
It's like,
I think at that point, and I don't know what, I assume, within your family, maybe you're having conversations about at what age you would feel comfortable with them being on social media. So maybe at that, starting the conversation in terms of, hey, so maybe, is it that, you'd say like 12, 13, whatever the age is, but saying like, we just want to kind of make you aware that this exists. And we want to be talking along the way. I think it can be with online usage in general, but one of the things I'm going to get to in some of the further slides is Common Sense Media has a really great family media contract in general that goes from kindergarten all the way through high school. That could just be some basics in terms of just starting the conversation and having something a little bit more structured to kind of get it going. But I think I would start with kind of having the conversation around what age your family has decided that it'd be okay. I'm sorry?
yeah, that's a tough one.
Yeah.
That's a question in the household.
I think it's hard to start it without kind of having a sense of here's what we would like and how we would like to introduce this to you. But I think starting and kind of having a sense of what that may look like or because that's not something that we can really say to you. I think that's an individual family decision of doing that. I think even just in terms of if your 9-year-old is even online at all, I think being able to watch whatever they're watching, talking with them through it, kind of perusing those things and sharing the time and making conversations around it, I think is a start, even if it's not exclusively social media. I'm going to continue, and then I think if there's still more questions around it at the end, I'm happy to address that. And then just in terms of the not criticizing your child's choice of friends, especially as they get older, this one we highlight because I think on social media, maybe you see your child has chosen a group of friends that you're not the biggest fan of and maybe engaging in behavior, or you're concerned because their friends are engaging in behavior online that you feel like maybe a little bit more adult than you want your child exposed to at this point. And I think really focusing on what you see, what you feel like is harmful or destructive and what you're concerned about versus sort of making it about your child's friends, I think is the approach that can be really, can prove to be a little bit more successful and maybe have less pushback, particularly as you get into the teen years. And then just kind of observing what they're going through and asking questions along the way and making sure that they know that you're available for those continued conversations. So boundaries and expectations. Being clear with the expectations, I think it's tough. I think, I think it does start within your family kind of deciding what you feel comfortable with. So you can be able to communicate that out, because I think it's hard to say what's okay for all young people. I think each individual is different, and I think, for those of you who are parenting multiple children, you may say, this one child, based off of their temperament and personality, I needed them to kind of wait till they were a little bit older, and I think that's okay, but just kind of being on the same page as a family about that, I think is really important. Then also just being able to have limits and enforce those consequences. So if there are limits around social media, so whether it's making sure to have curfews for all devices, for example. That's something where you could say, 8 o'clock you should be wrapping up and getting to bed. I'll take your phone, charge it overnight, but we're not going to have that in your room overnight. It's great way to sort of promote healthier sleep patterns, particularly at an earlier age, and not have them distracted by all the sort of alerts and things that come up. That blue light that Rachel mentioned that interrupts circadian rhythm, all of those things are an example in terms of limits. I think also just talking about if you guys do have dinner together, I know families are busy, but if you do have like regular meal times together, deciding whether or not you want to have devices at the table. I think that's another thing that's worthy of conversation within families, not advocating any particular approach, but just deciding what are the things that you want to sort of commit to as a family. And then once you decide on those things, and as your young person is coming up along the way, making sure that there are consequences that you and your family decide upon if they're not abiding by those limits, so that they know that there are parameters in this time where their brains aren't fully developed and they need some of those parameters and guardrails. Kind of touched upon this before, but the modeling what you want to see from them and kind of deciding what's comfortable for you and what you want to see from them. And I think also just being able to discuss situations that could come up. So I think for particularly the young ones who may just be starting on social media, I think this is a great opportunity to kind of say like, hey, here are some of the things that come up. If someone's talking like bullying, right? I was a school social worker for a number of years before, and this is where animosity sort of like had its own stage. Things would explode online, much like Rachel said, like having to do with romantic relationships, having to do with someone looking at them funny, having to do with like group chats where someone's talking about someone. And I think being able to kind of talk with your child and sort of role play, say this happened, like how do you think you would handle it? And kind of getting a sense and barometer for where their head is at and sort of using that to course correct once you have that dialogue open with them about common situations. And then also I think the piece around using media together. So even if they're not super active online yet, being able to sit down and watch TV shows, YouTube channels that your child might be interested in. Because I think the main thing is whether or not they're super versed and on social media all the time, I think the main thing you want to take away is that you want to be able to establish that you talk about these issues with them so that they have from an early age this understanding that like, oh, my parents are people that I go to sort of troubleshoot and to talk about and think about these things. And I think the using media together is a really beautiful way of sort of developing those media literacy skills that Rachel referenced and helping them to be critical consumers and thinkers does so much more than, like I said, any one app in particular. So that's something to consider. And it also, as you use media together, it's really an organic way to discuss your values and assess your child's beliefs. So cultivating digital citizenship. And I love this, the idea and concept of digital citizenship, because I think it's...
Sorry, I have a question related to the... So you were referring to, the limits within the family. Maybe you're going to get to it later, but from your experience, working with communities and schools, did you come across a good model of how to, obviously what we're doing tonight is great, but how to discuss it with, parents within a peer group where we want to set limits together somehow when the kids can get a phone, when or how long they can spend, playing a video game where there's 7 kids on the video games and they play it, and it's a social aspect and we want to limit it, but then other kids are continuing for 3 hours and we want to do it half an hour. Stuff like that. Is there some sort of, do you have advice on that? How, because every family is different and has their own limits, but it's challenging when within the community, obviously things are going to be different. And how, I think it could be very helpful if it's something that is agreed upon.
In a communal context. I haven't explicitly dealt with that because I think what's tricky is that a lot of times in our Western context, a lot of things are done more individualistically within the family unit. And I think what one family says works for them, another family may not say that. And I think there can be sometimes difficulty and, quite frankly, resistance to kind of being all normed on that. I mean, I think that's a really, in my mind, a wonderful opportunity, I think, to sort of almost like a grassroots sort of notion to kind of, if you're close to certain families where your kids play well together, to kind of have those conversations. But I do think it's pretty tricky to kind of be on that same page. And this is where I think in terms of the discomfort that comes, because yes, you're right, your child will come back and say, you're the only one that, like, you're so unreasonable. Nobody else's parent does this. They will be impassioned and believe this. And you may be the only one in that group who's saying this is what we're going to do with our families. So maybe this is something you could initiate amongst families at Big Street, but unfortunately it's not something that I've seen be done communally yet. Not that it shouldn't. But in terms of cultivating digital citizenship, I think what's helpful and what I appreciate about this framing is it's about not just using technology, but having ethical users of technology, right? Because I think at this school, the families you choose to send your young people here to this school, and I think this idea of promoting just being ethical beings in the world, I think is a really helpful framework if we think about not only designing technology, but also using technology in a way that brings more good and less harm. So this idea of consent on social media and modeling this, and this is something that someone mentioned once, and I thought it was such an interesting idea, would never have occurred to me, but even asking your child before you post their picture online, right? So that is a modeling of consent. It would have never occurred to me to think like, oh, that you should ask your child for permission for that. But I think that's a great way for them to kind of start learning that, like, oh, taking, even though it's funny seeing their friends sleep in class and they snap a quick photo, that's a violation of consent to just put that out there without sort of having permission being given for something like that. So that's something that's a really great way to model consent. And then promoting empathy, right? So I think being able to, the role plays in giving examples of times where the same way, and I go back to your question around your 9-year-old, where they're at an age that probably they're bearing witness to, or people being mean, that just plays out in life. Peer group relations can be difficult. And so I think even just kind of taking those situations and giving examples and saying, like, giving them guidance around how to respond, because I think while you want your children to develop and be their best selves, this time they're still learning about the ways to sort of be empathetic beings. And so kind of hearing how they respond and giving guidance around that and role playing, if that's comfortable for you, I think can be really helpful in terms of taking the lessons learned in life and sort of translating them to online work. And then encouraging delayed responses. Another great example I've learned recently is that could be an example for your young person, depending on how old they are, but this idea of even at work in the office, right? I'm sure I'm not the only one who's received emails that I've found to be inflammatory or incensed, and taking that moment to just sort of wait and say, you know what, before I start click-clacking at those keys, I'm going to give it 24 hours before I send a response, knowing that if I'm impulsive and I have an immediate reaction, I may not have a job tomorrow. So I think that this is a really lovely way to model to your child in a way that helps them to understand, first, that parents are humans as well, but also the same, that you want to cultivate the same sort of taking a moment, pausing. It's harder for them with their brains at their age, but still modeling that for them, I think, is very helpful. And then discussing examples from the news, your social media, to kind of drive home those points. I'm going to go
Can I
through
make
these.
one point about that?
Yes, please go
I think
ahead.
that's a fantastic page that you just went over, because it puts everything in a positive light, not just a limiting light for children.
Yeah.
Right? They see their parents providing that leadership and where to head, not what not to do.
Mm-hmm.
Kids respond. I wish I had done this earlier, but that's a great page.
Mm-hmm. I agree. I think more the kind of strengths-based, or more taking it from a positive approach versus no, no, no.
Yeah.
I do agree, tends to be more effective, which is why I really love this concept of digital citizenship and just like saying, I want you to be your best self. I know you can be your best self, and here's the way in which I think you can do that. I realize we're getting a little short of time in terms of questions, so I'm going to race through these last slides. I want to mention this is the family media contract that's on Common Sense Media's website. This is for the K through 5 age, but they have it all the way up through 12th grade. And so things like I will stay safe, this is a whole paper contract that I think whether or not you're as formalized with it, I think it's an excellent way to open up a conversation with your young person. And it gives an opportunity to establish kind of realistic rules around these things. But for example, saying I won't give out my private information like my full name, date of birth, address, like phone number without my family's permission. I think that's really concrete and helpful, but I think these are things that when I was starting to be online more, I don't know that I would have known all the things that, Rachel mentioned about geotags. There's still a lot of stuff I feel as an adult I'm learning about privacy and the way in which that can be violated. So having that be so concrete, I think for young people is really helpful. Keeping passwords private, and then also telling a trusted adult if anyone makes them feel uncomfortable online. So going back to sort of that piece of being grounded in communication as a family around the issue of being online and accessing social media. Then thinking first, so communicating kindly, another way of kind of, honing that piece around digital citizenship, and then respecting themselves and others. And I think respect is something that I'm always really passionate about, being really granular about what that means for that child and for your family in that context, and sort of laying out what your expectations are for them as well as your hopes for them in terms of online behavior. Then staying balanced, knowing that not everything they read or hear or see online is true. And I think Rachel highlighted this a lot, but this underscores for me the importance of having those conversations and sort of equipping them to analyze media and the things they're seeing online in a really critical way. And then in exchange, my family agrees to recognize that media is a big part of my life, even if they don't understand why. I love that part, because there will be elements as social media continues to evolve that sort of transcend your understanding, but sort of owning that that's a part of the culture and is here to stay. And then talk with them about what worries them before saying no. So that sort of ongoing dialogue, and then talking about your interests and helping them find stuff that's appropriate and fun. Okay. And then lastly, we have a slide of some resources and sites that we found to be useful. And once again, this will be sent on afterwards as a PDF for you to reference. Now, time for any further questions. Yes, you in the back there.
So, in a way, this kind of reminds me of when I see on television an ad for a medical condition I don't really have. I have just a pretext. I have an 8-year-old and a 10-year-old. So I see this ad and I don't have the condition, and I'm thinking to myself, look at all these side effects. Who would want to possibly take this medicine?
And also they say them really fast. So they
And so that's your presentation. One little slide on the benefit and all of these problems, right?
Mm-hmm.
So back to Ayelette's question earlier on, and our specific spaces that some of our children haven't yet experienced social media. And so my perspective after seeing this and after the research that I've seen is keep it as far away as possible for as long as possible. Mm-hmm. And that's the caveat, as possible, right? Mm-hmm. I would just like to keep it away forever.
Yeah.
So, I mean, why can't we, we're independent thinkers, we're at this progressive school, critical thinking, why can't we say no? It's hard enough parenting without this stuff.
Well, that's the question. I mean, and that's part of why we emphasize the risks part so much, because it's hard for people to say no to their kids, and we see the rewards, and it's easy to just want to give in. So we want people to understand sort of the severity of it. And the American Pediatric Association recommends kids aren't on social media till they're 13. So, saying no is not a bad idea. It's hard, and at some point you can't anymore.
I think I saw, yes, go ahead.
So I know we have a mix of ages here, but I am wondering, just to Michael's point, because the reality is they're not going to stay off forever. And what you didn't really talk so much about tonight, except for a little bit in the beginning, is kind of the reality of kids' social